At 9:47 a.m. on November 17, 1944, on the eastern edge of the Hürtgen Forest near the village of Vozenak, an American sniper was positioned where United States Army Doctrine said he should never be. Private First Class Jacob Hayes was not in a tree. He was not in an attic. He was not on high ground. He was lying flat on his stomach on the frozen forest floor, pressed into pine needles and mud, with his rifle barely 4 inches above the earth. According to every sniper manual issued by the U.S. Army, this position was tactically unsound. Snipers were trained to seek elevation. Height provided line of sight. Height reduced obstruction. Height allowed earlier target detection and longer engagement distances. A prone position at ground level was considered dangerously restrictive. Visibility was limited. Escape routes were slow. Counterfire was assumed to be fatal. Yet Hayes was there because all other options had failed. The sector he covered was collapsing. For 72 hours. German artillery and machine gun fire had suppressed American positions along a narrow supply road feeding Baker Company. The road ran through dense forest, broken by shell craters, fallen timber, and the remains of a shattered German pillbox identified on American maps as Agang 3. German forces were preparing a flanking maneuver. Intelligence estimated their strength at over 400 experienced grenadiers. If they reached the road, Baker Company would be isolated within hours. Stopping such a maneuver normally required an infantry company supported by artillery. Hayes was alone. He was also the last effective sniper left in the entire 28th Infantry Division sector. Previous sniper teams had been eliminated using predictable countermeasures. Elevated positions had become death traps. Trees were bracketed by machine gun fire. Attics were demolished with shaped charges. Observation posts were pre-registered for mortar strikes. The German units advancing through the forest knew exactly where to look. They looked up. That morning, the air was below freezing. Breath fogged instantly and dissipated under the low grey canopy. The forest floor was a chaotic layer of mud, pine needles, splintered wood, and buried shrapnel. Movement was slow. Sound carried unpredictably. Visibility rarely exceeded a few hundred yards. Hayes had been given a simple directive that was impossible to execute under existing doctrine. Stop the flanking force. He had 5 rounds loaded in his rifle. He had no spotter. He had no authority to be where he was. His commanding officers had previously threatened disciplinary action for using what he called the hole, a concealed depression he alone trusted. They considered it an unacceptable risk and a misuse of trained personnel. But those officers were now pinned down, struggling to keep their line intact. At this moment, doctrine no longer matched reality. The German patrol advancing toward the road moved with confidence. Their formation assumed that any American sniper fire would come from elevated ground, from the usual silhouettes against the sky. Their training and recent experience reinforced that belief. Hayes was relying on that expectation. The position he had chosen violated the fundamental principles taught at sniper school. Ground-level firing reduced range. It limited observation. It increased vulnerability to direct assaults. It eliminated rapid relocation. Any failure would result in immediate detection and death. But Hayes had observed something the manuals did not address. In the Hürtgen Forest, elevation no longer provided safety. It provided predictability. Every sniper who followed doctrine had been killed. The ground, however, was stable. It absorbed vibration. It reduced visual signature. It disrupted enemy search patterns trained to scan tree lines and rooftops. This was not innovation for its own sake. It was adaptation under pressure. As the German formation closed to within 300 yards, Hayes adjusted the crude cheek support on his rifle, improvised from canvas and pine sap. He checked his magazine. He did not adjust his position. At 9:47 a.m., he placed the lead grenadier's helmet in his scope. The moment represented a collision between formal military doctrine and an improvised solution born of necessity. According to training, physics, and operational planning, what Hayes was about to attempt should not have worked. A single sniper, firing from ground level, without relocation, should have been detected and neutralized within minutes. The manuals were clear. The probabilities were unforgiving. Yet the Forest had already proven that the manuals no longer protected the men who followed them. Hayes did not hesitate. He squeezed the trigger knowing that failure would not only cost his life, but would open the road behind him to a force large enough to break the American line entirely. This was not a heroic decision, it was a practical one. And it should not have been possible. According to United States Army sniper doctrine in 1944, the position Jacob Hayes had chosen was fundamentally unsound. Field manuals issued to American sniper units were explicit about survivability requirements. A sniper was expected to dominate space through elevation. Height provided extended lines of sight. It allowed early detection of movement. It created distance between the shooter and the enemy. Most importantly, it enabled rapid disengagement. After a shot was fired, a ground-level position removed all of those advantages at once. From the forest floor, visibility was sharply reduced. Under normal woodland conditions, effective observation from a prone position rarely exceeded 100 yards. In the Hürtgen Forest, where undergrowth was thick and terrain uneven, that distance was often cut in half. Sniper training assumed engagement ranges of 300 yards or more. Hayes was operating inside distances normally reserved for infantry. Mobility was the second problem. Sniper doctrine required relocation after 1 or 2 shots. The sound of a rifle report, combined with muzzle flash and disturbed vegetation, allowed trained enemy units to triangulate a firing position within seconds. Survival depended on moving immediately. Crawling, standing, or withdrawing along a planned route were essential components of the firing cycle. Hayes had none of these options. At ground level, relocation was slow. Standing up would instantly expose his silhouette. Crawling would disturb soil and vegetation, leaving visible signs that enemy patrols were trained to recognize. Remaining in place after firing violated every rule taught at sniper school. Ballistics compounded the risk. The M1903 Springfield fired a .30 caliber round. At high velocity, its effectiveness relied on a clean initial flight path. Sniper manuals warned against firing too close to the ground, where small obstacles could deflect a bullet before it stabilized. Roots, twigs, uneven soil, even frozen clumps of mud, could alter the round's trajectory. Hayes was firing with his barrel only inches above the earth. Recoil management was also affected. In a standard prone position with elevation, recoil energy was absorbed through the body and redistributed. At Hayes's angle, recoil drove directly into the ground. This reduced muzzle climb but increased vibration through the stock. Over multiple shots, accuracy degradation was expected. Sound behavior was another concern. Firing close to the ground caused sound waves to reflect unpredictably, instead of dispersing downward. The rifle report would echo upward and outward through the forest. Enemy troops trained to identify sniper fire would normally triangulate based on echo patterns and muzzle blast direction. Ground-level firing distorted those cues. But Doctrine assumed that distortion favored the enemy, not the shooter. Detection risk increased, not decreased. Environmental conditions made the position worse. The forest floor was saturated, moisture absorbed some sound but amplified others. Cold air carried noise farther. Breath vapor risked visual detection. Remaining motionless for extended periods increased physical strain and reduced reaction speed. Training manuals accounted for none of this as a viable firing method. From a tactical perspective, Hayes's mission profile made the choice even less defensible. He was attempting to disrupt a formation estimated at over 400 troops. Standard doctrine held that a single sniper could delay, but not halt a coordinated maneuver, unless supported by additional fire. Delay depended on confusion. Confusion depended on uncertainty about the shooter's location. Ground-level fire was assumed to be easily resolved. Enemy infantry doctrine reinforced this assumption. German training emphasized threats from forward arcs and elevated positions. Snipers were associated with trees, buildings, and ridgelines. Counter-sniper drills focused upward scanning, suppressive fire into canopies, and use of grenades against suspected nests. The ground beneath advancing troops was considered a mine threat, not a sniper threat. Doctrine on both sides aligned in dismissing Hayes's position as ineffective. The implausibility, as defined by manuals, was clear. A lone sniper at ground level should have been detected after the first shot. He should have been fixed by suppressive fire within seconds. Mortars or grenades should have followed. Assault teams should have closed the distance quickly. Survival beyond a few minutes contradicted training expectations. Sustained engagement contradicted probability. The manuals did not consider what happened when doctrine became predictable. By late 1944, German units operating in the Hürtgen Forest had adapted to American methods. They had learned where snipers preferred to hide. They had learned how to respond. Elevated positions were no longer advantages, they were liabilities. Hayes's position exploited that shift. From a purely mechanical standpoint, the shots were possible. Bullet drop at close range was negligible. Wind effects were minimal under the forest canopy. Targets advancing upright exposed their lower bodies before their upper torsos. The geometry of engagement changed. Doctrine, however, did not address geometry at 4 inches above ground. It assumed height. It assumed distance. It assumed predictability. Hayes removed all three. The manuals defined success as adherence to proven methods. They did not account for situations where those methods had already been defeated by the enemy. Under those conditions, what doctrine described as impossible became briefly achievable. Not because the rules were wrong, but because the battlefield had changed faster than the rules could follow. Jacob Hayes was 26 years old at the time of the engagement. He was not a career soldier. Before the war, his life had been defined by routine physical work rather than military ambition. He grew up in a rural environment where time was spent outdoors, often alone, moving through wooded terrain that changed with weather and season. That familiarity with forests, with uneven ground and limited visibility, formed habits long before he wore a uniform. When he was inducted into the army, there was nothing remarkable in his initial records. His physical examination was average. His early training reports showed no exceptional aptitude. He qualified with standard infantry weapons at expected levels. He did not distinguish himself in drill, classroom instruction, or formal exercises. He was assigned to an infantry unit because that was where most men were needed. It was during field training that instructors began to notice a difference. Hayes moved differently. He chose routes that others ignored. He spent long periods motionless without appearing strained. He showed an ability to notice movements that others missed. Not at long range, but close to the ground. When asked about it, he could not describe a technique. He simply described what he saw. That trait followed him into sniper training. Sniper school emphasized marksmanship, concealment, patience, and controlled engagement. Hayes met the requirements. His shooting was consistent. His breathing control was steady. His trigger discipline was reliable. He was not the highest scorer in his class, but he passed without difficulty. What set him apart was how he interpreted terrain. Most trainees gravitated toward elevation instinctively. Trees, platforms, and high ground were treated as natural solutions. Hayes did not reject those positions, but he questioned them quietly. In exercises, he repeatedly chose lower ground when given the option. Instructors corrected him. They explained the advantages of height using diagrams and field demonstrations. Hayes listened and complied when ordered. He did not argue. By the time he joined his unit in Europe, conditions had stripped away many of the assumptions built into his training. The forests of the Western Front were not open woodland. They were dense, broken, and saturated with artillery damage. Visibility was limited. Sound behaved unpredictably. Elevated positions attracted attention quickly. Snipers became targets. Early in the campaign, Hayes followed Doctrine. He used elevated firing points. He fired once or twice and relocated. Each engagement followed the same pattern. His first shot would land, his second sometimes did. Then counterfire arrived faster than expected. Machine guns swept the trees. Mortars followed. Survival depended on speed and luck. He watched other snipers fall. Some were killed immediately after firing. Others were wounded while attempting to relocate. A few were lost when artillery collapsed their positions entirely. Each loss reinforced the same lesson. Elevation no longer provided safety. It provided predictability. Hayes began to adapt cautiously. He did not abandon Doctrine all at once. He lowered his positions incrementally. First behind fallen logs, then from shallow depressions, then fully prone in areas where the ground itself provided concealment. Each adjustment reduced his field of view, but also reduced enemy response. Officers noticed the deviation. Hayes was warned that his positions were unsafe. He was reminded that snipers were trained to preserve themselves as much as to engage the enemy. At one point, his conduct was formally questioned. He was accused of unnecessary risk and of ignoring established procedures. Under normal conditions, that would have ended the matter. But conditions were not normal. Casualties mounted. Units were stretched thin. Experienced snipers were in short supply. Hayes continued to produce results, measured not in confirmed kills but in disruption. Enemy patrols hesitated, movements slowed, routes changed. No one could argue with the effects. Physically, Hayes was suited to the role in ways training manuals did not measure. He could remain prone for extended periods without shifting. He tolerated cold without excessive movement. His breathing slowed naturally when still. These were not skills taught by the army. They were habits developed long before. Psychologically, he did not seek engagement for its own sake. He did not measure success by numbers. He measured it by time. How long could he hold attention? How long could he delay movement? How long could he remain unseen? By the morning near Vozenak, Hayes had been operating with minimal supervision. Communications were unreliable. Commanders were occupied with broader defensive problems. He was given a task, not a method. Stop the flanking movement. How he did so was left to him. The decision to lie flat on the forest floor was not impulsive. It was the result of weeks of observation. He had watched German units move confidently beneath trees. He had seen how rarely they looked down. Their attention remained fixed at chest height and above. Their training reinforced that focus. Hayes understood that expectation. He was not attempting to redefine sniper doctrine. He was responding to a specific environment where doctrine had already been defeated. His position was not chosen because it was superior. It was chosen because it was overlooked. As he pressed himself into the frozen ground that morning, Hayes did not consider the broader implications. He was not thinking about manuals or probabilities. He was focused on the immediate problem in front of him. A narrow road. An advancing force. Limited time. Everything that followed depended on whether his reading of the enemy's habits was correct. At approximately 10:06 a.m., the German advance entered the forest corridor Hayes had been observing since first light. The movement was deliberate. This was not a reconnaissance patrol. It was a maneuver element advancing to secure ground beyond the American line. The spacing between soldiers reflected combat experience, close enough to maintain control, wide enough to reduce the effect of artillery and small arms fire. Rifles were carried low but ready. No one rushed. From his position, Hayes could not see the entire formation. He did not try. His field of view was limited to narrow channels framed by roots, fallen branches, and broken ground. He focused on the leading elements, watching how the movement flowed through the terrain. Distance closed steadily. 300 yards. Then less. Sound reached him before faces did. Boots compressing wet soil. Equipment shifting against webbing. Low voices carried briefly, then vanished, as the column adjusted its spacing. The forest absorbed and redirected noise unevenly. Hayes remained still. A standard sniper procedure dictated waiting for officers or radio operators from ground level. Those targets were partially obscured. Rank insignia was difficult to distinguish. Hayes adjusted his criteria. He selected the individual whose movement set the pace of the group. The one others followed without hesitation. When the distance closed to just under 100 yards, Hayes settled his breathing. He did not rush. He allowed the lead soldier to move fully into his narrow firing lane. When the man's body cleared the visual clutter of roots and trunks, Hayes fired. The recoil drove the rifle straight back into the ground. The report cracked upward through the trees. Soil sprayed lightly from the muzzle blast. Hayes did not move. The lead soldier collapsed forward. The formation stopped immediately. German training emphasized rapid response to sniper fire. Soldiers scattered laterally. Several dropped prone. Rifles came up. Fire was directed toward the trees and upper branches. Short bursts tore into the canopy. Bark splintered. Needles fell. No one fired at the ground. Hayes waited. Silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. The Germans regrouped cautiously. Two soldiers advanced together, crouched low, scanning trunks and branches. Hayes adjusted his aim slightly downward and fired again. The second man fell. The other dropped flat and rolled behind cover. Confusion spread. Orders were shouted. Fire erupted in multiple directions. The sound echoed unpredictably through the forest, making the origin difficult to identify. Hayes remained motionless, his body pressed into the frozen earth. Minutes passed. Movement resumed in short bursts. Small groups attempted to advance, while others covered. Each time momentum returned, Hayes fired a single round. He did not fire quickly. He allowed uncertainty to build. He let silence do as much work as the rifle. After the fifth shot, The German element halted entirely. A machine gun was brought forward and set up to break the tree line. Bursts cut through branches above Hayes. Wood splintered. Shards of bark struck the ground around him. Hayes did not move. The machine gun fire passed over his position. From that angle, it could not depress far enough to strike him without risking friendly casualties. At approximately 10:31 a.m., a squad attempted a flanking movement to the left. Hayes tracked them through gaps in vegetation. Distance was now less than 70 yards. At this range, discovery would mean immediate assault. He waited until the lead man crossed into his firing lane and fired. The effect was immediate. The squad halted. One soldier dragged the wounded man backward. Others froze, unsure where the fire originated. Several fired blindly into the trees. No one advanced. By this point, the Germans were convinced they faced multiple snipers. Later, reports would reflect this assumption. Fire was described as coming from different directions and varying heights. The inconsistency reinforced the illusion. In reality, Hayes had not shifted position more than a few inches. At 10:54 a.m., mortar rounds began to fall. The first landed short. The second overshot. The third detonated near a fallen tree to Hayes's right. Dirt and debris showered his position. He remained still. The mortar fire ceased after several rounds. Without confirmed targets, continued fire risked friendly casualties. Ammunition was limited. Time was not. The German force began withdrawing in stages. Small groups pulled back under cover. Hayes fired twice more, each shot widely spaced. Each caused another pause. By 11:17 a.m., the forest corridor was empty. Hayes remained in place for another 20 minutes. Only when the forest returned to silence did he crawl backward, inch by inch, retracing his entry path to avoid leaving visible disturbance. He had fired 13 rounds. He had not been seen. The flanking maneuver had been abandoned. In the hours immediately following the withdrawal, the effects of the engagement became visible only in fragments. American infantry units advanced cautiously into the forest corridor later that afternoon. They expected resistance. Instead, they found disturbed ground, scattered equipment, and signs of herd movement away from the road. Helmets lay abandoned near shallow depressions. Ammunition pouches had been dropped and not recovered. Drag marks cut through mud and pine needles, leading back into the deeper forest. There were no bodies. The absence complicated reporting, without recovered casualties or captured prisoners. The engagement could not be measured in conventional terms. No enemy position had been seized. No unit had been destroyed. Yet the German flanking movement had stopped completely. From a tactical perspective, that outcome mattered. The threatened supply road remained open. Baker Company was not isolated. Ammunition and medical evacuation continued through the night. Artillery units were repositioned to cover the corridor more effectively. Defensive lines were adjusted to reflect the delay. By nightfall, the immediate danger had passed. In after-action reports, the cause of the delay was described cautiously. It was attributed to persistent American sniper fire of unknown strength. No estimate of the number of snipers was given. No firing position was identified. The language reflected uncertainty rather than confidence. Jacob Hayes's name did not appear in those reports. The following morning, Hayes was questioned briefly by his platoon commander. The conversation was procedural rather than investigative. Where had he been positioned? How many rounds had he fired? Had he observed enemy casualties? Hayes answered directly. He described his general location without detail. He reported firing. Intermittently, he did not speculate on results. There was no reprimand. There was also no commendation. From a doctrinal standpoint, the action did not fit existing categories. Hayes had acted independently, outside approved firing positions, without a spotter, and without relocation. None of this aligned with sniper training standards. At the same time, the result had been favorable. The Army had no framework to evaluate such an action. Within days, the division shifted focus. Fighting in the Hürtgen Forest continued under the same conditions. Casualties mounted. Personnel shortages forced constant reassignment. Hayes was increasingly used as a standard infantryman rather than a dedicated sniper. His experience was considered useful, but his methods were not formally endorsed. No attempt was made to replicate what he had done. There were no training memoranda issued. No revisions were made to sniper manuals. Elevated positions remained the standard recommendation. Ground-level firing continued to be described as a last resort, suitable only under extreme circumstances. This decision was consistent with institutional logic. Hayes's success depended on factors that could not be standardized: terrain density, enemy expectations, weather conditions, individual tolerance for immobility and risk. None of these could be guaranteed across units or environments. What worked in one forest corridor could fail catastrophically elsewhere. The Army favored solutions that could be taught and repeated. Hayes's action was neither. As the weeks passed, the engagement near Vozenak faded from attention. It remained present only as an effect rather than a story. The road had stayed open. The line had held. Those outcomes were absorbed into broader operational summaries without attribution. From a historical perspective, the significance of the event lies in its limits. It did not alter the campaign. It did not change doctrine. It did not produce a new tactical school. It achieved something narrower. It delayed. In the context of the Hürtgen Forest, delay had value. Time allowed units to reposition. It allowed supply to move. It prevented a localized collapse that could have cascaded into a larger failure. Those effects were real, even if they were not dramatic. Hayes returned to routine service. His record reflected steady performance rather than exceptional achievement. There were no citations that referenced the forest engagement in detail. No interviews were conducted. No formal lessons were drawn. The forest itself absorbed the evidence. Rain softened footprints. Falling needles covered disturbed soil. Broken branches blended into the general destruction left by months of fighting. Within days, it was difficult to distinguish the site of the engagement from any other scarred section of woodland. What remained was an outcome recorded, without explanation. A German maneuver halted. A supply road remained open. An American line held. Doctrine continued unchanged. Hayes's action existed at the edge of formal history. It demonstrated not a superior method, but a temporary alignment between environment and expectation. The enemy had adapted to the rules. Hayes had adapted to the enemy. When the conditions shifted again, that alignment disappeared. In the weeks that followed, the engagement near the forest corridor faded almost completely from formal attention. The 28th Infantry Division remained locked in the Hürtgen Forest, a campaign defined by attrition rather than movement. Command priorities centered on holding ground, rotating depleted units, and maintaining supply under constant artillery fire. Individual actions that did not result in captured positions or confirmed enemy losses were rarely revisited. The incident involving the disrupted flanking maneuver was absorbed into routine reporting. Operation Ul's summaries noted that German movement along the corridor had stalled. Intelligence reports referenced hesitation and withdrawal without clear cause. No document identified a specific firing position. No analysis connected the delay to a single rifleman acting alone. This was consistent with how the Army processed information during prolonged combat. Events that could not be quantified were acknowledged only through their effects. Causes were generalized. Lessons were drawn only when repetition was possible. Hayes's action did not meet that threshold. Jacob Hayes did not seek recognition. He returned to standard infantry duties as manpower shortages increased. When asked about the engagement in later debriefings, he described only what he had observed. He did not present his actions as a tactical solution. He did not argue that doctrine should change. He did not attempt to formalize what he had done from an institutional perspective. That silence made the matter easier to leave unresolved. There were no interviews, no training circulars, no revisions to sniper manuals. Elevation remained the preferred firing position. Ground-level engagement remained discouraged. The risks associated with immobility, limited observation, and lack of withdrawal routes remained real, regardless of one outcome. From a doctrinal standpoint, the Army's response was rational. Hayes's success depended on conditions that could not be reliably recreated, dense terrain that restricted sightlines, an enemy conditioned to expect fire from above, whether that masked movement and sound, an individual capable of remaining motionless under extreme stress. Remove any one of these factors, and the outcome likely changes. Doctrine is built to reduce failure across thousands of soldiers, not to accommodate rare alignments of circumstance. What Hayes achieved was effective, but it was not repeatable by design. As winter deepened, fighting continued under the same constraints. Casualties mounted. Forests remained shattered. The campaign progressed without resolution. Individual actions dissolved into aggregate outcomes. Hayes survived the war. After demobilization, he returned to civilian life without public acknowledgement of the event. His service record reflected routine infantry duty with intermittent sniper assignments. There were no citations tied to the Forest engagement, no preserved testimony beyond standard personnel files. The episode remained present only indirectly, embedded in broader operational results. From a historical perspective, its significance lies not in heroism but in contrast. Military doctrine assumes typical behavior under typical conditions. It cannot fully account for adaptation at the margins, where environments distort expectations and training becomes predictable. In the Hürtgen Forest, elevation ceased to provide advantage. Predictability became vulnerability. Hayes responded by abandoning the assumption rather than rewriting the rule. The Army did not follow. That choice reflected institutional caution, not failure. For every deviation that succeeds, many others end. In catastrophe, systems are designed to favor reliability over exception. The Forest that November did not produce a new method. It produced a delay measured in hours rather than territory. That delay mattered to the units dependent on the road behind Hayes. It allowed supply to move. It allowed lines to stabilize. Once achieved, it vanished into routine. Rain fell. Footprints softened. Disturbed ground blended into the surrounding damage. Within days, the site of the engagement was indistinguishable from the rest of the forest floor. What remained was a brief alignment between environment, enemy expectation, and individual adaptation.